Welcome to our series, Terrifying Ways to Go, a series in which we delve into some of the darkest corners of human existence, exploring the chilling and often disturbing ways in which people have met their untimely demise. From freak accidents to bone-chilling murders, each episode will take us on a journey through some of the most sinister and horrifying true stories of our time. So buckle up and ride along as we venture out into the abyss, trying to make sense of all of this madness. As always, I must warn you, this series is not for the faint of heart. In this episode, we will be looking at 6 separate yet horrifying instances of industrial accidents. Without further ado, let's talk about some terrifying ways to go, episode 2, Industrial Nightmares. That being said, this first one takes us to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, back in 1986. The General Electric implosion you have never heard about. So back in September of 1986, an employee for GE's aviation division was in the process of conducting altitude tests on a jet engine nose cone. Now the way they go about doing this was they place the cone into a vacuum chamber, seal the door, then slowly decrease pressure until the desired atmosphere had been reached. The cone is then left inside the chamber until the allotted time has passed. However, this chamber in particular had a small porthole in order to perform visual inspections along the way, and at some point, the employee walked up to the window, leaned forward, placed his hand on the glass in order to reduce glare, and the window suffered a catastrophic failure, sending pieces of glass flying into the chamber while simultaneously dragging him partway into the hole. To make matters worse, he had become completely trapped inside the aperture. The 12-inch opening had effectively locked itself around his right armpit and left side of his neck, and unfortunately he would spend his last few moments having to come to terms with the fact there was absolutely nothing he could do. Official cause of death, positional asphyxia due to the implosion of a vacuum chamber. Now it's worth pointing out, just 2 months later in that same year, a completely unrelated yet horrifying instance occurred involving the implosion of an acid renewal system, which is what we're going to talk about right now. Back in November of 1986, an employee working for Avtex Fibers out of Front Royal, Virginia, was in the process of troubleshooting a leak on an evaporator for an acid renewal system. Now, while this process is much more complicated than what I'm about to tell you, what you need to know is this: the system operates under vacuum, meaning the leak was not forcing liquids or gases out, but it was actually taking on air, thus hindering the processes ahead of the evaporator. Well, for one reason or another, the decision was made to make the repair while the system was still online, when all of a sudden, the steel sidewall of the evaporator imploded, sucking the man inside, sustaining several serious injuries in the process. What's more is, he had not only been doused from head to toe in this extremely corrosive chemical, but he was now breathing in the fumes as well. And while we don't know exactly how long employee number 1 was trapped inside, what we do know is that unfortunately, he ended up passing away due to complications as a result. Among other injuries we simply cannot mention here. Total fines incurred by Avtex in 1986 were $900. Now it's also worth pointing out, there have only been 5 instances of implosions ever recorded by OSHA, and not a single one of them actually occurred underwater. More so, you have just heard the only 2 that actually have any details whatsoever in their reports. For example, one report states an implosion occurred in the mid-90s. However, the actual OSHA report literally only states that an employee died as a result of an implosion. But for now, we're going to go ahead and talk about one of the most horrifying situations to ever occur in the presence of a piece of equipment known as a spiral cooler. Lily Hernandez. Tragic in every way. So back in December of last year, a then 29-year-old Lily Hernandez had just recently started a job through a temporary staffing agency. And well, her job through that agency entailed working in this rather large pizza factory located in Gurnee, Illinois. Among her list of duties was the late-night cleaning of various pieces of equipment. That being said, in the early morning hours of December 22nd, Lily was tasked with cleaning what is referred to as a spiral cooler. Now essentially the way this works is, pizza enters the machine via conveyor belt on the bottom. It is then frozen as it continues to pass up through the system, going round and round at a very slow speed. Nevertheless, she was left unattended with minimal training and told to clean the machine. And at around 1 a.m., Lily gets down on the ground and proceeds to crawl under the cooler while it's still in motion. But just as her head began to enter that space, Lily was caught by the belt, which began slowly pulling her closer and closer towards one of the outside legs, giving her ample time to realize just what was about to happen. And before too long, Lily quite literally lost her head in what can only be described as a Final Destination style incident. Maricapo Pizza, the company at fault, was handed a total of 29 citations in accordance with $2.8 million in fines. But it's also worth pointing out, as of June this year, they have contested or disputed each and every one of them. That being said, we've talked about implosions, we've talked about vacuums with acid, we've talked about conveyor belts, now it's time to talk about heat. Back in December of 2010, the then 54-year-old Alan had been working at the Piranha Kayak molding facility located in Runcorn, England. Now essentially the way this works is there are 2 molds for every 1 kayak, a top and a bottom. And while the first part of this process involves adding a powder known as linear polyethylene to said bottom mold, the upper mold is then placed on top, where even more powder is dumped inside through a small hatch. Now it's at this point a button is pressed, thus drawing the mold inside of this giant rectangular oven you're seeing right here. Well, shortly before 9 a.m. on December 23rd, an employee had just finished the process of powdering up a mold. However, upon activating this oven, the system returned an error code essentially stating the unit had to be cleaned prior to further production. The individual in question then notifies Alan just prior to using the bathroom, but upon his return, the code had been cleared out, all leading up to the critical moment he activated that oven while Alan was still inside performing maintenance. The doors would then close automatically as temperatures inside reached well over 500 degrees in just a matter of minutes, effectively sealing his fate in the process. And the thing is, no one even noticed anything was off until they saw smoke billowing out of the top of this thing. The process was then halted, and upon opening that oven, the discovery they made was absolutely horrifying. Alan had unfortunately spent his last few moments beating and prying on that door with a crowbar in a desperate attempt to escape. Further investigation would find Piranha Moldings, the company at fault, had not been enforcing lockout-tagout procedures at the time, which, for those of you who don't know, essentially means that oven should have been incapable of being turned on while somebody was inside. Piranha Moldings would incur about $200,000 in fines as a result. In addition to this, an escape hatch was made to be placed on each and every one of those ovens. But here's the real kicker. The individual who pressed that button was due to marry Alan's daughter in the near future. And as of the last update about this incident, roughly 4 years after the fact, the wedding was said to still be on. Which brings us to our next story, just across the water in Germany. So back in May of 2009, there was a guy by the name of Marcus. He had been working at a soup factory located in Lübeck, Germany. And well, one evening he was given the task of cleaning these giant vats in which they produce their soup. So he makes his way up, enters the hatch, climbs back down into this giant 6-foot vat, and before you know it, he is scraping all the gunk that has built up along the sides. When all of a sudden, for one reason or another, the latch slams down, locking him inside the cauldron. And as he's standing there trying to pry his way out, it is very likely he would have heard the sound of a valve opening as piping hot steam along with boiling water begins blasting in all around him through these jets that are lining the walls of the vat. This is a process known as sanitization. Essentially, it is the last line of defense of ensuring each and every batch is contaminant free. And before too long, the temperature in this giant industrial pot had reached well over 300 degrees, effectively sealing his fate in the process. Now, despite the fact there were other people in this factory when it happened, not a single person heard his cries for help. As a matter of fact, they didn't even notice there was a situation until they realized he was nowhere to be found hours later. And while there was never a definitive reason as to why the hatch had closed, further investigation would show there was absolutely nothing this guy could have done, as the process was set to occur automatically after the hatch had closed. And unfortunately, this is all we really know about this case. No news of any citations or any out-of-court settlements, as there was only really one round of news releases just after the incident occurred. That being said, this next one brings us to Michigan for the absolutely horrifying story of Daniel Hill, completely submerged. On February 9th of 2019, 54-year-old Daniel Hill said goodbye to his wife and kids, grabbed his keys, and drove off to work at the Michigan Seamless Tube plant. But unfortunately, he would not be making it back home. You see, one of his tasks that day involved gathering samples from this giant vat of piping hot sulfuric acid. And it is theorized sometime around 12 p.m., Daniel lost his footing, thus he had become completely submerged in the chemical with no way of getting out on his own. To make matters worse, the corrosive substance was kept at temperatures of around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And while no one knows exactly how long he had been inside this thing, what is known is that around 12:20 p.m., he was spotted inside the vat by another worker. It was at this point several employees rushed over to pull him out, receiving minor burns in the process. And here's where things begin to get downright horrifying. While Daniel was able to walk around and talk after being pulled out, by this time he had already suffered severe burns over 100% of his body. In turn, Daniel would spend the next 12 hours in the hospital fighting for his life before ultimately and unfortunately succumbing to his injury. Now, it's worth pointing out, MST, the company at fault, was hit with a $32,500 fine. This was after Michigan Occupational Safety noted 5 citations with more than 63 violations, a list of which included but was not limited to failing to adhere to proper confined space procedures, failure to enforce personal protective equipment, i.e. chemical-resistant goggles, face shields, among other chemical handling procedures. And here's the thing, after posting this story on TikTok, I had quite a few people telling me, look, it really doesn't matter who you are, gloves are not going to help you in this instance. And while yes, that may be true, you really got to understand, when these sort of things happen, roughly 90% of the time, OSHA is going to come in and absolutely clear house and cite you for anything and everything they find, which is basically what happened here as for the case of Hailey Hernandez. Nevertheless, this last one takes us to Duluth, Minnesota, for the story of Brad Watiziak, the Gap of Doom. So back in September of 2022, an employee working for Northland Constructors out of Minnesota was performing maintenance on one of these giant industrial conveyor belts used in asphalt recycling operations. More specifically, the component he was working on is referred to as a tension pulley or take-up pulley, which, for those of you who don't know, on this system is located just underneath the belt itself, roughly halfway down. And as the name implies, this mechanism is used to apply tension to said belt. However, as with a lot of these incidents we've discussed, the decision was ultimately made for that individual to not only perform the work alone, it was to be done while the system was still online, meaning this giant cylinder was in rotation the entire time. And this is where things get downright horrifying. In the literal blink of an eye, employee number 1 was caught pulling both arms between the belt and the guide post of that pulley, a gap to which was only about 4 to 6 inches at the time. And without getting into too many of the absolutely gut-wrenching details about this case, let's just say his arms continued to pass through while he himself was left on the other side of that post. They had become completely detached, sending him careening right down into the gravel pit. And to make matters worse, while there were other employees on site at the time, none were in Brad's immediate area, meaning we really have no idea how long he was left there before he was found. What is known is that not a single person actually saw it happen, and that he was found much later in the night when he had long since passed away. And although Northland Constructors was given $50,000 in fines, it's also worth pointing out, as of March this year, they contested both of those citations. So that's it, y'all. That is going to do it for this episode of Terrifying Ways to Go. If there are any specific topics you would like to see in this series, feel free to let us know in the comments below. As always, my friends and frenemies alike, I sincerely hope you have an amazing whatever it is, wherever you may be.